Zia, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Another depressing budget hoves into view, another tax-raising budget, another budget that doesn't have the courage, the guts to cut public spending, and I think the level of pessimism amongst businesses, amongst savers, amongst those that have assets of any kind has not been lower in modern times. I think for some years we've actually been living under an illusion. We've not been prepared to face up to just how much of an economic mess we're genuinely in. As we slip down the global league tables, we kid ourselves. Well, it's okay. We've got GDP growth. But there wouldn't have been any GDP growth over the course of the last few years if it wasn't for mass migration on a scale hitherto never even contemplated.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, checking the news, and discovering that if a general election were held today, Nigel Farage would be Prime Minister with a thumping three-figure majority, whilst Labour would be reduced to fewer seats than they had during the dark days of the 1980s. Not a slight improvement for reform. Not a modest gain. A complete, total, absolute demolition of the established political order that would fundamentally reshape British politics for a generation. Well, you don't need to imagine it, because a massive poll of 16,000 people has just dropped, and the results are so explosive they probably set off seismographs in Westminster. Reform UK would win a majority of 115 seats with 381 MPs. Labour would slump to just 85 seats. 85. That's not a defeat. That's an extinction-level event. Strap in, because we're about to dissect the most stunning poll in modern British political history. Quick favour. If you're loving what we're doing here at British Mirror, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes about 2 seconds, and honestly means a world to us. Cheers if you've already done it. Right, back to the show. Let's start with a headline number that should have every Labour MP reaching for the strongest whiskey available. Reform UK would win 381 MPs in Westminster according to this More in Common poll. 381. That's not just a majority. That's a supermajority. That's the kind of parliamentary dominance that lets you do basically whatever you want because the opposition is too small to effectively resist. To put that in perspective, Tony Blair's legendary 1997 landslide gave Labour 418 seats. This projection has Reform within shouting distance of that historic result. Nigel Farage, the man who spent decades as political insurgent, dismissed as a protest vote merchant, derided by the establishment as a popular charlatan, would be sitting in Downing Street with more power than any Prime Minister in recent memory. But here's where the numbers get properly wild. In this hypothetical scenario, Reform UK will win 60% of the seats with 31% of the vote. 60% of seats from 31% of votes. That's first past the post doing what it does best, which is producing wildly disproportionate results that bear absolutely no relation to the actual vote share. It's the system working exactly as designed, which, depending on your perspective, is either brilliantly efficient or fundamentally broken. Reform would benefit from exactly the same electoral mechanics that gave Labour their massive majority in July 2024 despite winning only 34% of the vote. What goes around comes around, and the wheel of electoral fortune has spun viciously against Labour. Meanwhile, Labour would slump to just 85 seats. 85. That's a loss of 326 seats from their July 2024 landslide. 326 seats vanished in less than 2 years. To call that a collapse doesn't do it justice. That's a political apocalypse. That's the kind of wipeout that ends careers, destroys reputations, and gets studied in political science courses as a cautionary tale about what happens when governments lose touch with voters. Labour won 411 seats in 2024. They'd be left with 85. That's losing over 3/4 of your parliamentary presence. That's going from dominant majority to irrelevant rump in record time. Luke Tyl, More in Common UK director, delivered the news with the clinical precision of a doctor informing you that yes, it's terminal. He said Reform continues to hold pole position in their MRP, and based on polling since the budget, it suggests that in an election tomorrow, Reform could hope to secure a substantial three-figure majority. Substantial three-figure majority. That's not hedging. That's not being cautious. That's stating clearly that reform would absolutely dominate. He also noted the Polanski surge sees the Greens continue to make gains, with disillusioned progressives putting them within shouting distance of many more gains from Labour. So Labour isn't just losing to reform. They are hemorrhaging support to the Greens as well. They are being squeezed from both directions, losing working-class Leave voters to reform and middle-class progressive voters to the Greens. That's the worst possible electoral position, trapped between two insurgent parties eating your coalition from opposite ends. Luke Tyl continued with what can only be described as a gentle euphemism. Labour would slump to a modern low, losing over half of the total number of seats in Parliament and being reduced to just 85 MPs. A modern low. That's putting it mildly. This would be the worst Labour result since before the First World War. This would make the 1983 disaster under Michael Foot look like a respectable performance. This would be Labour returning to their roots as a minor parliamentary party, except instead of building upward, they'd be collapsing downward from the heights of power. The psychological impact of that kind of defeat will be devastating. How do you rebuild from 85 seats? How do you convince talented people to enter politics when your party has just suffered the worst defeat in living memory? But wait, because whilst Labour faces extinction and Reform celebrates impending dominance, the Conservatives are experiencing something rather odd. Luke Tyl noted that while the Tories would lose a further 50 seats from their 2024 nadir, this projection actually represents an uptick in the Tories' fortunes and signs that the bad Enoch bounce may at least be stabilising their position in places like the Blue Wall, even as they lose seats to Reform in their Brexit-voting former heartlands. An uptick. The Conservatives, who suffered their worst defeat in history in 2024, are actually doing slightly better in this projection. They'd still lose another 50 seats, dropping them even further. But at least they are stabilizing. At least the hemorrhaging has slowed. That's the political equivalent of being told your condition has stopped deteriorating quite so rapidly. Not exactly cause for celebration, but better than the alternative. The model projects some fascinating results for smaller parties as well. The Greens are projected to more than double their parliamentary presence from 4 to 9 seats. 9 seats. That's still tiny in absolute terms, but more than doubling your representation suggests genuine momentum, genuine appeal to a specific slice of the electorate. Meanwhile, half of the current Liberal Democrat MPs are projected to lose their seats. Half. The Lib Dems, who had a decent 2024 election by their recent standards, would be carved up, losing seats to both Reform and potentially the Conservatives in tactical voting scenarios. That's the danger of being the middle ground compromise choice. When voters polarize, when they move to extremes, the center gets squeezed mercilessly. At what point does this takes time become an admission of failure rather than a request for patience? The Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act that became law in December introduces new criminal offenses and counter-terror-style powers to crack down on smuggling gangs. That sounds impressive until you realize that we already had laws against people smuggling. We already had enforcement powers. The problem has never been lack of legal authority. The problem is lack of political will to use the authority we have, lack of resources devoted to enforcement, and most fundamentally, lack of an effective deterrent that makes crossing the channel in small boats an unattractive option for migrants. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's November announcement of the most significant changes to our asylum system in modern times also deserves scrutiny. The reforms, inspired by Denmark's system, would make refugee status temporary with reviews every 30 months, and refugees would wait 20 years for permanent settlement instead of 5. That's genuinely tougher than current policy, and it sparked backlash from Labour MPs who called it shameful and accused the government of echoing Farage's rhetoric. But here's the thing, those reforms haven't been introduced in legislation yet. They are just announcements, promises of future action. And even if implemented, they don't address the fundamental problem of people arriving illegally in the first place. The criticism from Labour MPs that these reforms echo Reform UK is also revealing. It shows that Labour is internally divided on immigration, with the progressive wing viewing any enforcement or restriction as right-wing and shameful, whilst the government tries to appear tough to voters who elected them partially on promises to control immigration. That internal tension makes coherent policy impossible. You end up with rhetoric that sounds tough to reassure voters, combined with implementation that's weak because your own backbenchers rebel against anything genuinely restrictive. Conservative leader Kimi Badenoch's argument that these measures don't go far enough and that leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is necessary represents a tougher end of the political spectrum. Both Conservatives and Reform UK want to quit the ECHR, viewing it as a fundamental obstacle preventing effective immigration control. Labour insists they won't leave but will seek to adjust how immigration cases are interpreted in UK law, which sounds like having your cake and eating it too. You can't remain bound by a treaty whilst interpreting it so differently that you're effectively ignoring it. Either the ECHR constraints matter or they don't. Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy meeting ECHR member states to discuss reforming the treaty to address illegal migration is theatre. The ECHR is not going to fundamentally change its human rights protections because Britain is frustrated with immigration consequences. Other member states don't share Britain's small boat problem to the same degree and have no incentive to weaken human rights protections that they value. This diplomatic outreach will produce nothing of substance whilst allowing Labour to claim they're exploring all options short of actually leaving the treaty. Now let's talk about the one-in, one-out returns deal with France that Farage calls a farce. Under this pilot scheme, people arriving in the UK by small boat can be detained and returned to France in exchange for an equivalent number coming through safe and legal routes. As of mid-December, 193 migrants had been sent back to France and 195 had arrived under the deal. So it's basically a one-to-one exchange with no net reduction in numbers. Worse, there have been cases of migrants being returned to France under the deal, then crossing again and being caught, requiring a second deportation. How exactly is that a deterrent? The scheme's fundamental flaw is obvious. If you get caught crossing illegally, the worst that happens is you're sent back to France, from where you can simply try again. And in exchange for accepting returns, France gets to send equivalent numbers to the UK through official channels. So Britain isn't reducing overall immigration. It's just shuffling people between categories whilst creating the appearance of enforcement. This is what Farage means by calling it a farce. Its immigration policy is theatre rather than substance. The human cost of this policy failure is also worth noting. At least 17 people died attempting the journey last year according to French and UK authorities, though there's no official record of channel fatalities. The International Organization for Migration reports possibly 36 deaths linked to attempts to reach the UK from mainland Europe. These deaths are tragic and preventable.